and welcome to this Enreach seminar. This is the third in a series that we'll be running all year, and we're delighted today to have anthropologist Chika Watanabe with us. Very excited about this paper. Chika has worked with various development, emergency relief, and other NGOs since 2002, and continues to hold an interest in international aid work from both academic and practitioner perspectives. She completed an MSc in forced migration at the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford in 2005, and a PhD from Cornell University in anthropology, and held a postdoctoral associate position in the Inter-Asia program at Yale from 2013 to 2014. Now a senior lecturer at University of Manchester, Chika is probably, right now at least, perhaps best well known for her magnificent patchwork ethnography, which is a research and pedagogy project led by Chika and her colleague Gosa Gunel. The project seeks to challenge the ways that all of us practice and teach ethnography while offering methodological innovations. Today's paper, however, is entitled Decentring Disasters in Disaster Risk Reduction, Promoting Life History, Research with Children and Older People. And though it's presented by Chika, it has also had collaborative contributions from Jenny Moreno, who is an assistant professor in social work at the University of Concepción, and Boris Sáez, who is the chief of the Department of Disaster Risk Management in the Municipality of Talcahuano. Did I say that correctly? No, not really. Without further ado, I will turn over now to Chika. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Kelly and Judith, and thank you so much for having me and for being here. Let me just share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. Kelly, you can tell me if anything goes wrong. Great, thank you. So this talk today is based on a collaborative project that I've been doing with Jenny and Boris. With Jenny since 2019, and with a break because of COVID since 2021, I've been working, the both of us, Jenny and I, have been working with Boris very closely since then on this project. Which, as you can see in the logo on the slide, it's called Voces de Resiliencia, or Voices of Resilience. So today I'm going to be, as the title suggested, I'll be talking about life history interviews, which is a methodology that we've used in this project. As you know, many of you probably already know, anthropologists, ethnographers, other empirical critical disaster scholars have done a lot of extensive work capturing the life experiences of people who survive devastating disasters. There's been quite a bit of work that's been done with oral histories after Hurricane Katrina in the United States, for example. You can see some books that take that kind of approach. For example, Standing in the Need is an ethnography that follows an extended family and their years of recovery after Katrina. Alice Fothergill and Laurie Peake, who are known for working with children and young people after Katrina, have, one of their many books is Children of Katrina, that also focuses on the, interviews, participant observation with children to try to capture their experiences of recovery. Voices of Princeville is also another project coming out of East Carolina University that also uses oral life histories of people, African-American communities in a town in the US to understand their experiences of devastating floods, but also their stories of resilience across different aspects of their lives. So it's very clear that oral histories are an important part of disaster research, especially in capturing the experiences of recovery. And memory work around disasters is also quite active as an area of research, but also of intervention in Chile. One aspect, which I'm not going to go into, but Obviously, the work of oral histories in Chile has a deep and long and complicated history because of the dictatorship, the military dictatorship that was in place from 1973 until 1990. And there's been a lot of memory work that happens around that. But there's also a lot of memorialization projects around disaster. A well-known organization is Fundación Proyecta Memoria, and they began after the 2010 earthquake and tsunami that hit Chile. But they do a whole range of different activities and events related to memory work around all kinds of disasters, not just earthquakes. So, although oral histories in the wake of a crisis or disaster are often used to illustrate the hardship and injustice the survivors have endured, these oral history methodologies are also used to showcase the fact that survivors are not only victims, but also active agents in disaster and recovery contexts. Alice Fothergill and Laurie Peake's work with children, as I mentioned before, for example, really emphasizes this. The children are not only vulnerable, but they also play active roles in the recovery process of their families and their communities. And, policymakers also do try to balance these two perspectives, that marginalized groups such as children and older people have particular vulnerabilities, but they also have, capacities for resilience. For example, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has a page where they highlight activities around inclusion that they do. And part of that, for example, is about empowering children and young people, which they frame as being particularly vulnerable to disasters, but also, quote, as powerful change actors and resilience builders. The UN says similar things about older people, that they're both vulnerable, but that they also have valuable assets to contribute to reducing disaster risk and creating resilient societies. Right, but balancing these two, these marginalized groups as both vulnerable and resilient is challenging, right? How can we make sure that we include both of those perspectives? So based on our experience working with older people and children in the town of Talcahuano in Chile, we propose that life history interviews are key to an inclusive disaster risk reduction approach that reflects survivors' own terms of engagement and not only technocratic ones. And we say this because when oral histories and studies of memory are framed as disaster research, analyses and recommendations tend to be focused on the factors of those memories that are more or less directly relevant to disasters. Right, it seems pretty obvious, right? If you're doing an oral history project about disasters, the findings tend to be about disasters. But based on our experience, we realized that this tends to overlook the fact that when you talk to people and you ask them about memories of disaster, they talk about all sorts of things, right? They talk about disaster, but they also talk about other experiences of hardship and resilience, such as poverty or war. And this is something that disaster scholars in Japan have also found, that older people who experience, for example, the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, when they tell those memories, they also recall their experiences of the Second World War, right? And so our argument is that decentering the focus on disasters is important for an inclusive disaster risk reduction that goes beyond the terms that are set by policymakers, because the people considered to be most vulnerable in disasters, so in our case, children and older people, often remember and interpret disasters in a wider context of hardship and resilience in life in general. So we propose that life history interviews should be a key methodology to include marginalized people's frameworks for resilience and disaster risk reduction, to capture what we want to call common resilience. And as the seminar series In Reach, the theme, has said, people are made hard to reach because the terms used to include people are often alien to them, right? So, we want to ask, can we bring the framework closer to the people rather than trying to bring the people closer to policies that already exist? And we believe that life history interviews can be a technique to expand that framework to be based on the terms that survivors use, especially older people that we've talked to. So critical disaster scholars have argued that disasters are not one-time events with a big E, but that disasters are manifestations of everyday structural inequalities and injustices. So there's a famous saying disaster scholars often say, that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, right? Because it's the infrastructures, the political systems, the inequalities, the injustices that create disasters. So if there's a hurricane on a deserted island, there is no disaster, right? So there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Scott Knowles, a disaster scholar, has talked about slow disasters, right? That takes into account poverty, colonialism, all these processes that have existed for decades and centuries that lead to the making of disasters, right? And it also means that the factors that give rise to disasters, so poverty, for example, right, they're part and parcel of the hardships and difficulties that people experience from day to day. So we propose that, this also means that, since people experience hardship in everyday life, they also have the capacity to overcome them, right? They also have the skills to get past those difficult experiences. And so resilience is embedded in life as a whole, right? So scholars, so making that argument that resilience is part of people's everyday lives obviously, has problematic connotations. Scholars have argued that resilience should not be seen as a psychological, individualized capacity that one has or doesn't have, because that can be a depoliticizing and dehistoricizing approach that emphasizes, the individual's can-do attitudes to bounce back, right? It falls into the problem of being a neoliberal concept that places the onus of survival, resilience, recovery on individuals and communities, and excuses the state from fulfilling their responsibilities, right? Disaster scholars, especially anthropologically informed ones, have argued that, instead resilience should be understood as a societal, historically contingent resource that's built over time. It's subject to power contestations and is contingently determined, right, by specific political and historical conditions, right? At the same time, we want to also not throw out the person in this emphasis to try to underline the sociopolitical factors of resilience, right? We want to bring the person back into the concept of resilience. And so in advocating for the use of life history interviews, we want to center the person and understand resilience as a lived, as something that is lived in the everyday, and it's experienced through and built through personal journeys. As my colleague Olga Ultragasheva has actually argued in relation to indigenous youth in Siberia, right, bringing the person back in, but without resorting to psychological arguments about grit or character. And this is just a picture from one of the life history interviews that we've done in Talcahuano. And I'll get more into that in a minute. So Talcahuano is a coastal town in central Chile. As you can see, Chile is that very long, narrow country. So it's in that central part. And it's a town of about 150,000 people next to a much larger city of Concepción. It's known for its fishing industry, as well as other steel and industrial factories. And there's also the Navy. And because it's by the sea and it's a peninsula, it's surrounded obviously by ocean. And so they have a high risk of flooding and also tsunamis, and as well as forest fires that happens on the hills every year. And of course, earthquakes are a risk for everyone in Chile. So Talcahuano, the people in Talcahuano experienced the 1960 Chile earthquake, the largest ever recorded in history. But to a greater extent, it suffered under the 2010 Chile earthquake and tsunami. You can see the picture above with the boats on the street. That's one of the pictures from 2010 when the tsunami washed into the city center and large parts of the city, and many people were displaced. So Boris Sáez, that Kelly mentioned, is the chief of the disaster management department in the city of Talcahuano. It's the first municipal level disaster management department that was ever created in Chile. And it's been there since 2011, I believe. And Boris has actually trained in Japan many times. He's attended many training programs run by the Japanese government. And Japan, that's where I met Boris for the first time in 2016. And since he's been going there, he's been particularly taken with these methodologies that use fun, attractive methodologies for involving children and their families in disaster preparedness. And so since 2014, he's been doing a whole range of very creative, fun activities with children in schools around disaster preparedness. So we've been collaborating since we met in 2016, 2017. And then Dr. Jenny Moreno is a social work researcher at the University of Concepción. She was at Manchester for a little while, which is where we met. Coincidentally, she is from Concepción and has worked in Talcahuano for many years. And she has also worked with Boris. So different coincidences came together. And so the three of us have been working together since then. And as I mentioned, since 2021, we've been working very intensely together, a wonderful collaboration, one of those silver linings of the pandemic, because I was supposed to go to Chile in 2020, but of course I couldn't go. So we put the project on hold for a year. I was supposed to go again in 2021 to conduct the life history interviews myself. But again, Chile was one of those countries like Japan where I couldn't go. So then Boris and Jenny took the lead, and they carried out the interviews. They've been leading the project since then. So long story short, Boris and Jenny carried out the first interviews with 12 older people from September until I think it was November or December 2021. In the lead up to this work, I did some, literature review on oral history methods. We drafted some guiding questions and so on together. And a big part of the aim consisted of trying to find out if the older people had concrete tips about disaster preparedness based on their experience of 1960 and 2010, the earthquakes. And this came out of my research in Japan, where a nonprofit organization that I work with and that I study, they've been doing oral history interviews with survivors of the 1995 Kobe earthquake and other disasters. And these older people had told them very specific, concrete survival tips, right? For example, they said that after the Kobe earthquake, they didn't have running water. So they used cling film to put on plates. Then they could keep the dishes clean, be hygienic without needing water, because they could then just, throw away the cling film afterwards. Or they would say, handkerchiefs were very useful because they could be used for multiple uses. Or shopping bags were really useful because they could use it as a makeshift slings for broken limbs, right? So they had very specific advice that came out of these oral history interviews. And so I was hoping that, the talking to older people in Talcahuano would also uncover these very locally specific, bottom-up sort of, tips for how to be prepared for a disaster. At the same time, we did want to understand people's experiences of disaster and survival in the wider context of their lives. For example, what were their responsibilities when they were children, when the disaster happened? Who do they live with? What do they eat? How do they buy, store, and prepare food? What was their relationship with neighbors, like, and so on. And our hunch was that this wider context probably shaped how people survived the earthquakes and tsunamis of 1960 and 2010. And we hypothesized that their strategies for making do in times of poverty probably informed their strategies of survival during disaster. Right, so armed with these ideas and guiding questions, Boris and Jenny went out and did their interviews in September. So these are the people that we interviewed, 12 people in total. So let me see. Right. So the first interview was with Petronila, Señora Petronila, that you can see there. And her daughter is actually, you can see the daughter in the background as well. So they did the interview, and they, I wasn't there, but they recorded all of these interviews so that I could watch it from Manchester. And I was on holiday at the time, but I came back, we had a meeting, and they told me that they were extremely frustrated by the interview. And especially Boris was super frustrated because Petronila talked about, how her family had to go look for water during the earthquake in 1960. She has maybe first aid kits in the house, but Señora Petronila didn't really have concrete ideas about how to be prepared or lessons learned or anything like that, right? And so, according to Boris himself, he's a civil engineer by education, by training. And so, he said that, because of his training, he approached things in a very structured way. And so he was looking for clear answers to each question, right? And so he did not get the answers that we wanted in the first interview. And so he was frustrated. And in order to correct what he thought was a mistake in the way that we had formulated the questions, he tried to limit the openness of the questions, right? He tried to create less space to ask people about their lives in the 1960s in general, for example, right? So his strategy was to ask more pointed questions like, what tools did you use to face a new disaster in 2010? Or what would you advise a child on how to be prepared for an earthquake? But this reorienting of questions didn't work because Petronila and the other older people that they spoke to just kept talking about their lives in general back then, right? They kept talking about the wider context of the hardships that they faced, different experiences that they'd had in life. So after 2 or 3 interviews like this, Boris realized that he had 2 options. One was to keep insisting on this strategy and conclude that the research did not work, or 2, rethink what he had been doing so far. So after the first couple of interviews, he told me that he said to himself, we're fighting something that just isn't natural for our interviewees. For them, the tools that they had to survive disasters were the tools they had to face life challenges. To negate this and to try to extract information focused on disasters just won't work. But the results we were getting were actually richer than what we had planned for. And Jenny, to a slightly lesser extent, but she also had a similar trajectory from frustration to revelation. And so through their recounting of that experience, I also realized that we were mistaken in narrowly directing our questions at disasters, and questions that were aimed at extracting knowledge that might be useful in a disaster, right? So out of this frustration of not getting the answers that we're looking for, we learned the important lesson that resilience in a disaster, obviously, perhaps, comes from resilience in life in general. Right. And, I went back to my field notes, and after talking to Boris and Jenny in October 2021, I wrote down, it's important not to turn all memories into instruments for disaster risk reduction. So this is not, hopefully it's not a psychological definition of this can-do attitude of individuals, but it's also not a sociopolitical analysis of resilience, as other anthropologists have expertly, argued. It's a view of resilience from the perspective of the older people we interviewed. It was emotionally charged, personally meaningful set of experiences for them. For the older people, talking to Boris and Jenny was apparently very moving, and many of them hugged at the end, which is not particularly common even in Chile after a first interview. And this affective element of the life histories was contagious. Boris and Jenny found that they were also very emotional after every interview. They told me that they were planning to do 3 interviews per day, but found that doing 2 was the most they could handle because they were also emotionally shaken after talking to them. They told me that each story made them reflect on their own lives, their own hardships, and their own capacities to overcome them. They also thought about their relationships with their parents and grandparents, and those experiences of disaster and poverty that both of their families had experienced. So, we started out looking for specific tools that could be extracted from people's life experiences, but we learned that life is so much more fluid and resistant to instrumentalization than we had anticipated. So the life history interviews reveal, the importance of recognizing that from the perspective of, so-called vulnerable people, marginalized in policies around disasters, right? There's no such thing as disaster resilience that's separate from resilience that comes from everyday life. And so, we want to acknowledge what could be called perhaps common resilience. And I like the word common here because, as the OED tells us, common means, a whole bunch of things that I think could apply here, right? Belonging to or shared by more than one person or party as a result of cooperation, joint action, or agreement. It's open to or free to be used by everyone. It relates to or is a characteristic of ordinary people. And according to a woman in Gillian Evans' ethnography of a white working class community in London, a woman called Sharon, right? Being common is about being down to earth, not thinking you're upper, better than other people, right? It means telling it like it is. And being common for Sharon and her neighbors also meant making do with limited resources. And, looking beyond disaster studies literature toward climate change scholarship gives us some allied concepts for what we're calling common resilience. Specifically, feminist geographers, anthropologists, and sociologists have recently argued that we need to pay attention to the everyday labor that makes climate adaptation work possible. So much of this labor is imposed on precarious populations, such as prison inmates who do forestry work to fight fires in California, for example. But even if the labor is not forced on people, it's often marginalized and disenfranchised groups that are living on the precipice of climate change that end up doing this work. But valuing their labor of adaptation can also be a way to center their life worlds and knowledge. Right, some scholars have called this labor of adaptation a form of feminist and ecological repair and care work. For instance, Joshua Griffin, who's conducted ethnographic research among Arctic indigenous people in Alaska, has written about how their strategies to adapt to a changing climate are entangled with wider experiences of everyday precarity due to centuries of US colonial violence. Right, so echoing what we're arguing here, he writes that pacing our attention to climate change as a slow event is also to restore the rightful space for those longer-lasting forms of precarity, which in the life of many communities are even more ubiquitous. So the everyday labor of adapting to climate change amidst precarity can generate insight into what we call common resilience, right? People's abilities to change to their labor practices and values in everyday life to survive and even make a good life for themselves and their loved ones amidst difficult life circumstances. So the idea of repair, it doesn't offer an innovation or a revolution, but it's a kind of work that stitches one day to the next. And it's the kind of repair work that we see the older people we interviewed, engage in. Right, so we're calling what we did life history interviews as opposed to oral histories because oral histories tend to focus around particular events. But because we expanded to talk about people's entire lives, we're calling this life history interviews. But, I think the distinction is, quite, artificial in some ways. I think it was both. So the life history interviews, because of time, I was going to talk about the recruitment process, but I think I'm going to skip that. If you're interested, I can talk about that later. And so they recorded the interviews. I watched them, and Dr. Jeremy Gunson was a postdoc on the project that helped transcribe the interviews. And he did that work in the early part of 2022. And then in April 2022, I was finally able to go to Chile for about 3 weeks in between teaching and admin work. And that's when we conducted the second round of interviews with the older people. And this time we went with a film crew to make a documentary. And these are some pictures of that visit from 2022 in the process of making the documentary. You can see Petronila again standing up. And then we have, to the right, we have Señora Rosa. At the bottom, we have Señor Ulises and Señor Humberto. And I just finished transcribing, putting subtitles, English subtitles on the documentary. And I'm not going to show the whole thing. Obviously, it's 40 minutes. Hopefully, we'll have a hybrid screening of the full documentary in May. So everybody is invited. But I just want to show you a short clip where Humberto and perhaps Ulysses, they talk about their lives. So you get a sense of what it means that the stories about disaster spilled over into talking about hardship and resilience in life in general. So let me see if that works.
Cuénteme un poco qué estaba haciendo usted previo al terremoto, a lo mejor estaba acá en la casa, si se acuerda que lo que...
No, mira, lo que pasa es lo siguiente, que estaba el Festival de Viña y estaba más o menos terminando, ya estaba tan latoso el asunto porque ya habían pasado las horas, digamos, como que eran las 3 de la madrugada, las 4 de la madrugada, yo no seguía, qué sé yo, como soy medio telemaníaco, entonces yo seguía mirando y ya de repente mi mujer me dice, ya está bueno, ya o sea, durmamos mejor, y lo largamos a dormir. Y de repente empieza el remesoncito chiquitito así. Y yo le digo, porque yo no sé, siempre he sentido y presentido las cosas. Yo presentí que algo me estaba moviendo. Y le digo, Maritere está temblando. Y la Maritere me dice, sí, me dice, está temblando. Y sabes tú que empieza el temblor más fuerte, más fuerte, más fuerte. Después ya le dije, mira, yo lo que me acordaba, que yo había escuchado que uno se colocaba debajo del lindel de la puerta y con eso se podía salvar si la casa se caía. No, pues ahí estaba, me agarré el lindel de aquí, pues. Me agarré aquí nomás y estaba la puerta media abierta así, pero estaba media... Y esto aquí pasé prácticamente el remesón, pues. para arriba, para abajo, para todos lados.
¿Qué fue lo más difícil de quedarse solo?
No, echarla de menos, pum. Echarla de menos. Lo que pasa es que yo soy muy apegado, yo soy muy de piel. Y cuando uno es así, echa mucho de menos a las personas, pum. Sobre todo a mi mujer, que estuvo conmigo 42 años. Pum. Como que al principio no podía creer que estaba solo y que tenía que defenderme solo. Porque uno dice, no, es que lo que pasa es que esto, que el otro, no, es que lo que pasa es que yo tengo, mis chiquillas vienen a verme, todo lo que tú quieras, vienen a almorzar conmigo los días sábados porque trabajan. Los sábados, los domingos vienen a estar conmigo, pero sí se van. Y al principio me daba una cosa, como te digo, como me afligía un poco el pecho, pero después me empecé a acostumbrar, pues sí que cuando... Ahora digo, ¿y a qué hora se van a ir? Claro, porque uno se empieza a acostumbrar. Pero bien, sí, pues bien. O sea, ahora bien, pues, porque yo la sufrí re harto solo.
I'll just stop it there because for the interest of time, but hopefully it gives you a taste of the documentary. So we were really, blown away. We knew from the first interviews that Boris and Jenny had done that the stories were not going to be only about disasters. So we went in with wider questions about their lives and ready to listen to them. But they really were really powerful. Yeah, I won't give away some of the stories, but some of the stories were very emotional. And like I said, these life histories are very contagious in their affective impact. So in April 2022, when I visited and we did those interviews with older people, we also worked with children, 10 to 13-year-olds from 7 different schools. We first did a survey with 230 of them, asking about their families, what do they do for fun, and also about their relationships with the older people in their lives. Interestingly, I think, people, there's the conception that people live in multi-generational households in Chile, and I think that's true. But interestingly, this was a survey, so as anthropologists, I would want to dig into it a bit more if I had time. But when we asked, who do you live with, 45% said they live with their mother and father, and only 26% said they live with their grandparents, whether it's, one or both of their parents. But so only 26%, answered that they live in a multi-generational household. And the majority of them said that they spend most of their time with their mother, and only 6% said that they spend a lot of time with their grandparents. And so one thing that struck me is that perhaps older people do play a part in children's lives. They pick them up. Some of them are guardian from school. They pick them up from school. Some of them are the children's guardians, and so on. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they spend quality time talking or speaking about life experiences or disasters, for that matter. So then based on those oral history, the life history interviews we did, and those interviews and surveys with the children, we conducted intergenerational workshops that brought the 2 groups together. Ultimately, there were 20 students who joined, and the 12 older people from the project. And so this was sort of the setup of the workshop. The children pretended to be a reporter. We had prompts about stories of disaster, but we told them you can talk about anything. You can ask them about their lives, their childhood, anything that you want to know about. So they spoke together, we paired them up, and they spoke for a little while. Then the student would draw whatever caught their most attention. We didn't say, you know, you have to draw about disaster. They just drew whatever they wanted to draw based on what they, you know, what they discovered about the older person. Then they shared these stories, and then we also played some, you know, traditional games together. And we did 2 of these workshops for the older people. The children were different. And we found that, you know, repetition was really, you know, great for the older people, because by the second workshop, they knew exactly what to do. And they just, you know, got down and, you know, and just led the workshop, you know, with the children. So here you can see Flor and Antonella, that we paired them, and you know, Flor was delighted because she was a nurse for many years, and Antonella wants to, you know, be in medicine when she grows up, and we knew that, right? And that's why we paired them together. But they were, you know, delighted to be, you know, to share that interest in life. And you can see Antonella drawing a picture of the story of when Flor and her daughter experienced the 2010 earthquake. And, you know, a TV fell on and shut the door and so on. There was another story of Don Orlando, who talked with a boy, Tomas, and they shared, you know, stories about having lost people they love. And, you know, Orlando, you know, began to cry, you know, talking about this, and, you know, Tomas, the boy, stood up and gave him a hug. And, you know, there were a lot of stories like that, a lot of, you know, connections that formed between the children and the older people, not only around disasters, but also around experiences of, you know, of difficulty and pain, and, you know, and having lived through that. You know, one of the things that, you know, that was important for us to, you know, to see and realize is that the young people were, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, but you know, they had already gone through, you know, quite difficult experiences themselves. And, you know, it was, I think, meaningful for both groups to, you know, to be able to sort of hold each other, you know, in that shared experience. We also played games, which was really fun. The game with the dice on the right-hand side is called Payaya, which I grew up in Spain, and we played something like this in Spain as well, where you have to, you know, pick up basically stones or seeds, you know, in one hand. So yeah, they really, both groups really enjoyed doing that. So some of the feedback that we got from the older people, you know, one set of comments was that the older people were surprised by the children in a good way, right? They say, you know, they said that they learned from the children. One of them said, you know, when we have family get-togethers, you know, we talk more with our older daughters and sons-in-law, but, you know, not so much with our grandchildren. You know, the grandchildren, when they come, they, you know, often on their mobile phones, for example. You know, another older person said, you know, one child, you know, asked me, you know, what were you like? You know, what were you like as a mom? You know, she wasn't interested really in disaster. She wanted to find out, you know, what was I like as a mom? And I told her that I was strict. I would say that my children's job was to study, to be responsible and do their tasks, tasks at home that they needed to learn. Right. There was another set of comments where the older people felt themselves reflected in the children, that they were moved by that. One of them said, you know, I love the activity. The child who interviewed me left me feeling motivated because I felt reflected in him. Our lives seemed related somehow. Right. And the children also, you know, really enjoyed the activity. Again, this was, you know, I had to go back to Manchester, and Boris and Jenny, you know, we couldn't follow through with interviews, and so these were questionnaires, unfortunately for an anthropologist, but it did indicate that they did enjoy talking to the older people. You know, they 52% said they, liked the game of pretending to be a reporter. In other words, speaking to the older people. 90% said they enjoyed talking with the older people. 95% said they enjoyed playing with the older people. And the majority said that they would like to spend more time with older people. And when we asked them, what they learned from them, the children said, they recognize, older people have lived very difficult moments in their lives. That's something we can learn from. I learned that we are never alone, and we have to stay calm in difficult moments. And we also asked them, what do you think you could teach older people? And a few of them said I could show them how to use technology in a way that can help them in a situation of risk. And that was something that, I think we could build on, because for the older people, seeing children on mobile phones had a negative connotation, but clearly technology can also save lives. And that can be something that children can also teach older people. And one of them said, it was the best, and I liked it. So, I want to be back, to do this activity. And we asked them, what's one word that would describe the activity? And these were some of the words that they put forth. So Voces de Resiliencia, in addition to the documentary, we also produced a number of different products. One was at the bottom corner, you can see it's a booklet, illustrated book of the life history interviews. Each person is accompanied with a really nice caricature or drawing that a designer did for us. Another is comics that some children drew based on lessons related to disaster management. These are the different children, but they drew comics themselves. And then you can see the map of Talcahuano in the corner, which is a tabletop game that we designed based on the disaster risks and resources that exist in the town, in the city, and also based on the life histories of the people who live there. We've tried these, the tabletop game, and there's something powerful about seeing their community, their houses being reflected in the educational material that they're going to be using. We've continued to get feedback about the impact that the life history interviews has had on the older people. Just by coincidence, we met someone from a different research group from a different university in Chile. She was doing a different activity with Boris and some of his colleagues. And she happened to tell us that she talked to some of the people who were the protagonists in our project, in our documentary. She says that she approached this group of community leaders, and one of them, or a few of them, had been in our project. And apparently they said, "Oh, you must watch this documentary," and then sat them down and made them watch the film. And how important it had been for them, right? They said, they felt famous. They said they really liked the activity because it was the first time that someone listened to them, and that they have so much more they want to do and so much more to give to others. And that's why they also want to participate in our research project, right? In that other person's project. Every 10 minutes, they would tell us about the documentary. They told us, all about their lives. One of them said, "Hell, I was tasked with being a mother, as a sister to my brothers, at a very early age, because her mother had died young, and it's like life was preparing me for something bigger, right?" She and others told me that if they hadn't had those experiences in life, they might have been in shock during the earthquakes. Maybe they wouldn't have known what to do. That opinion was common in their narratives to us. And also, again, as I said, these life histories are contagious. The older women that these researchers talked to, they also wanted to learn a bit more about her own grandparents, how they lived through the earthquake, because this researcher was also from the south of Chile and was, impacted by the 1960 earthquake. So, in the end, neither the life history interviews nor the intergenerational workshops were about disasters per se. They ended up being about other things, especially from the perspective of the older people and the children who participated. But by decentering disasters, they were able to find other powerfully emotional ways to connect to each other, right, despite being strangers who had never met. We can probably say that the intergenerational connections they made with the children, but also with us as slightly younger adults, made the older people feel valued and perhaps even more resilient. Right, disaster research shows the importance of social ties for survival and recovery, and we've seen this in research from around the world. Other studies on climate anxiety, for example, indicate that social connections and collective action can help people feel resilient and hopeful. So, social connectedness or kinship in the wide sense of the term is probably one of the most important sources for climate and disaster action. But one of the most fundamental relationships in our lives, between younger and older generations is not necessarily well studied in disaster or climate research, especially using anthropological perspectives. And we know from, for example, Black feminist scholars who have shown that marginalized people, in the United States, have responded to oppression and hardship through what they've called kinfold strategies, right, that reconfigure intergenerational relations, right, strategies that expand what it means to be kin in order to, make do and do the repair work that's needed to, go from one day to the next, right? And so, bringing the two ends of the generational spectrum together can foreground voices of marginalized groups like older people and children, who are more active actors than policymakers perhaps assume. And we also think that it can shed light on how intergenerational relations and solidarity can help people engage more with disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and climate adaptation efforts. Right, if we use the terms of common resilience, right, the terms that people use to understand the hardships and the ways that they overcome them in their everyday lives, right, not just through disaster, then it can be a form of intervention that resonates with the worldviews of, so-called out of reach people. Right, so by shifting our focus in this way, by decentering disasters and embedding the work of disaster resilience in the rest of life itself, we think that the work of disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation can become part of all sorts of departments in municipalities, schools, and other institutions. Right, it becomes work that is not only the responsibility of emergency risk or environmental departments, right? It's a kind of strategy and approach that everybody can be part of because everybody, right, is able to tap into this concept of common resilience. And we believe that life history interviews can be a way to get at that. So I'm gonna stop there. I just want to if you're interested, we have a website for the project. It's in 3 languages. So if your first language is not English, at least there's Spanish and Japanese there. And just want to thank Dr. Jeremy Gunson, Dr. Pedro Silva Rocha Lima, and Camila Valdivia, who helped with research for this project. Great.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Chika.
I'm gonna